You are an IB history student studying the Cold War, so you need to understand the Korean War, a very important event in the Cold War. Today I will be considering three questions. First of all, was the Korean War a proxy war? And I would say very much it was a proxy war, although you can't say that it was a proxy war for the United States, considering that the United States was actually fighting the war. However, the deeper struggle was the Cold War struggle between capitalism and communism. In other words, the struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the Koreans got trapped in the middle. So I would say, yes, the Korean War was a proxy war. The second question that I want to consider today is, did the Cold War become more dangerous as it shifted from its European origins to Asia? And the answer, again, is very definitely yes, the Cold War became more dangerous. And we'll learn that in the Korean War, the use of so-called tactical atomic weapons or nuclear weapons was very much a possibility, and the United States considered using its nuclear arsenal against either North Korea or China or both. So very definitely the Cold War became more dangerous as it shifted from Berlin to Korea from 1949 to 1950. Lastly, you might be asked by an IB exam to analyze the impact of the Korean War on the development of the Cold War, and I'll say a few words about that in terms of the escalation of the Cold War, the advent of Eisenhower and his policies, and the possibility of the Cold War turning into a nuclear confrontation, the impact of the Korean War on the United Nations, etc. So those are some of the questions we'll be thinking about today. And before we get talking about an analysis of the Korean War, let's just have a rough idea of what happened, a brief overview of the factual aspects of the Korean War. The Korean War began on June 25th, 1950, because Kim Il-sung launched an invasion of South Korea with the permission of Stalin. And he had previously, the previous year, he'd been denied permission to invade South Korea, but a couple of developments in late 1949, first the atomic bomb developed by the Soviets, and second, the declaration of the People's Republic of China, the victory of the communists in the Chinese Civil War, emboldened Stalin, and of course Stalin was also reeling from the embarrassment of his crisis in Berlin. So Stalin changed his mind from 1949 to 1950, and he gave permission to Kim Il-sung to launch the Korean War, and there's no doubt that that's what started the Korean War. It caught most of the Americans by surprise, and it caught the South Koreans under Syngman Rhee by surprise, and the initial phase of the Korean War was disaster for the Republic of Korea, that is South Korea, and the United States, and they withdrew to Busan, the second city of South Korea, and they dug in around the city of Busan in what's called the Busan Perimeter, and they almost lost the war right then and there, but they got reinforcements from Japan, and within 2 weeks, Truman was in the United Nations, or the United States was making the case for a response to what Truman famously called this naked and unprovoked aggression. And the Soviet Union was not in the United Nations at the time because they were boycotting the United Nations, because the Soviet Union felt that the People's Republic of China, not the Republic of China or Taiwan, should get the permanent seat in the Security Council. So the Soviets were not there and were not able to exercise their veto power. So 15 nations sent military aid to the United States and South Korea in the Korean War, including Thailand and the Philippines. And the second phase of the Korean War occurs after September of 1950, when MacArthur, the leading American general, attacks at Incheon, which is west of Seoul, and he attacks behind the enemy lines, and this works brilliantly. And then, with the United Nations backing, the UN troops push the North Koreans all the way up close to the Chinese border. So that's the second phase. There are really four phases to the Korean War. The first phase was the advance of the North Koreans to the Busan perimeter. The second phase was the push of the UN troops back to the Chinese border. The third phase begins in October of 1950 when Chairman Mao sends initially 200,000, but eventually close to 1 million troops, Chinese troops, the so-called People's Volunteer Army, into Korea, and they push the UN forces back below the 38th parallel. Seoul is recaptured again. I think Seoul is captured and recaptured 4 times during the Korean War. And the UN appears to be losing because the Chinese have come in with this massive influx of manpower. However, the winter of 1950-51 is a very severe winter, and the Chinese overextend their lines, and they have difficulty supplying their troops. So by January and February of 1951, the Chinese are having to withdraw and are being pushed back by the UN forces. And that's the third. So the third phase was the Chinese push southward, and then the fourth and final phase is the stalemate that occurs around the 38th parallel. And for the last 2 years, although there's fighting, there's very little changing of ground, and the last 2 years are a stalemate, and that's the fourth phase of the Korean War. So those are the 4 phases of the Korean War. One last thought especially during 1950 and 51, but throughout the Korean War, the U.S. is considering whether to use atomic bombs, and they certainly assembled or partially assembled some of their bombs, I think 9 of them, in Japan. And MacArthur, of course, very much wanted to use them, and it was something that Truman mentioned in a press conference, and I think he deliberately mentioned it, although historians disagree with that. Some historians disagree with that. They debate about that, and there's question about whether Truman was very serious about using the bomb or not, but he certainly said that decision rested with him. Truman would, of course, be replaced by Eisenhower during the Korean War, and the Korean War was the dominant theme in the campaign of 1952. Okay, so was the Korean War a proxy war? I think the answer to that is definitely yes, although, as I said earlier, the U.S. was fighting its own proxy war along with 16 other nations. And, the evidence for this comes from the Soviet archives and from the American archives in terms of the involvement of so many other countries. And Kim Il-sung had asked Stalin, as I mentioned earlier, and Kim Il-sung had spent about a month, most of the month of April in 1950, just 2 months before the Korean War, in Moscow lobbying for Soviet support in terms of permission and material support for the invasion of South Korea. So Stalin backed him, and so did Mao. Mao and the Chinese were reluctant at first, and there was quite a bit of debate in the Politburo about what China should do. And Lin Biao, who, of course, would famously later become number 2 in China, declined an offer to lead the Chinese forces. So he was one within the leadership of the People's Liberation Army who did not think it was a good idea to get into a fight with the Americans. Mao, however, very enthusiastically wanted to, and of course he drummed up many slogans about resisting the American imperialists and aiding the brother Koreans during the Korean War. So he, again, as was Mao's wont, he used foreign issues, such as the Korean War, to push his own domestic campaigns and to push the leadership of the Communist Party and of Chairman Mao within the domestic scene in China. One other area that you should look at in terms of arguing that it is a proxy war is that both sides were trying out a lot of new armaments, and in particular jet fighters. And this new breed of jet fighters was post-World War II breed of jet fighters were being tried out in the Korean War, and the early successes were certainly on the Soviet side, which was a major advance militarily for the Soviets because their air force was not much to be reckoned with in World War II. But they had, interestingly, captured some German know-how, some German scientists during World War II, and they either copied or I think they actually got a license to use Rolls-Royce jets in their engines, Rolls-Royce jet engines in their jets. And therefore, the Soviet Air Force was much more advanced than it had been during World War II. And the U.S., again, were caught by surprise by how advanced these MiG-15s were. And the Americans responded, and not only the Americans, the British and other countries as well. And in particular, the Americans found some success with the F-86 Sabres. And so I guess the point is that there were a lot of armaments being tested, and this was very much a part of a proxy war. The Western Europeans also got involved to some extent in the Korean War. As I said already, the British sent troops, and the Western Europeans were very worried that what was going to happen was that the United States would get bogged down in some terrible war with China, and this would be an opportunity for Stalin to march into Western Europe. I think that was a pretty unrealistic fear, but they certainly had it. I should also mention, in terms of the Korean War being a global war, the U.S. policy towards Japan completely changed during the Korean War, and this is known as the reverse course. It was a 180-degree change, U.S. policy towards Japan. Japan was no longer considered an enemy power that needed to be occupied, but a friendly country that needed to be enlisted in the fight against communism. And, of course, the U.S. ended its occupation of Japan in 1952 during the Korean War. So the next question is, did the Korean War make the Cold War more dangerous? And I think the answer to that is absolutely. As the Cold War moved from Berlin in 1949 to Korea in 1950, it became much more dangerous because it became a hot war. It was no longer about airlifting candies and supplies to Berlin. It was being fought on the ground, and millions of people died in the Korean War. Most of them, of course, Koreans. The vast majority of them Korean civilians, and some of those killed by the South Koreans themselves and by Americans and by North Koreans. Yes, as I said earlier, the United States assembled some atomic weapons in Japan, or partially assembled them, and had them ready to go, and it was very much a possibility that the U.S. might drop atomic weapons if the Korean War was not going its way. So this was a major danger. And Mao was particularly reckless about this. He didn't seem to be a bit concerned by the danger that major population centers in China might be bombed by atomic bombs. Mao very famously quipped, it doesn't matter if they blow up most of the world with nuclear bombs, because there will still be 300 million Chinese left to repopulate the planet. So the danger in the Cold War, I think the Korean War was certainly one of the most dangerous times of the Cold War, because the U.S. and the Americans, the Soviets and the Americans were facing each other, and in MiG Alley with the airplanes, there were Soviet pilots there as well. And the Americans knew that the Soviets were involved, and the United Nations forces knew that the Soviets were involved, but they conveniently ignored that because they were worried about escalating the Korean War. So both sides were very well aware that this could turn into a disastrous world war. Meanwhile, the United States 7th Fleet was flexing its muscles in the Taiwan Straits, and there was a considerable worry, and there was some agitation by the Taiwanese that the U.S. and China might get involved in invading the People's Republic of China, and in the view of the Taiwanese, in the view of Chiang Kai-shek, liberating it from the communist menace. So what was the impact of the Korean War on the Cold War? Well, to me, this was the point from which there was no turning back. Once the United States got involved in this war against communism, the anti-communist McCarthy hearings and the anti-communist hysteria that gripped the United States was in full swing, and this escalated the Cold War. Obviously, it escalated the Cold War when you look at a hot war in which somewhere between 1 and 3 million people died. The United Nations, of course, with the Soviet Union not being there, sided with the West, with the capitalist powers, in particular two Norwegians, the General Secretary, who was Trygve Lie, and Arne Lunde, the head of the Security Council, were siding with the West in the Korean War. And this was a real nuisance, a real annoyance to the Soviet Union throughout the 1950s and into the 1960s. This would be one of the themes that we see throughout the Cold War. The Soviet Union is constantly complaining that these international bodies, such as the United Nations, are acting as agents of American domination. So another point to note in the Korean War is that now, with the Korean War, we can see that the Cold War has absolutely shifted its focus from Europe to Asia, which of course would be the focus of the Cold War, with the exception of the Cuban Missile Crisis and the Berlin Wall and a few other incidents, over the next 20 or 30 years, as the Cold War shifts to Vietnam, to Indonesia, even to Thailand, to the Philippines, etc. Asia becomes very much the focus of the Cold War after the Korean War. I should mention that the Korean War was the beginning of the implementation of the National Security Council document NSC 68, where the U.S. commits to enormous spending and a fierce anti-communism throughout the world as its policy throughout the 1950s. So, yes, again, we see that the Korean War marks the escalation of the Cold War. Could you argue that tensions between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China begin in the Korean War? Well, if you dug through the archives carefully enough, you might be able to. The question is, when do the Chinese begin to understand this concept of big brother chauvinism? When do they begin to resent the Soviets dictating of how the Cold War will be fought to the People's Republic of China? And I think that you can find some evidence that there is resentment about the way the Soviet Union was dictating to the People's Republic of China during the Korean War. Of course, the other impact of the Korean War on the Cold War is once the armistice is signed in 1953, once the lines are drawn, and it's clear that South Korea will join the capitalist camp or North Korea will join the communist camp, then these two systems become showpieces for the capitalism or the communism, and in particular on the West. Over the next 20 or 30 years, South Korea goes through a very painful implementation of democracy. Of course, under Syngman Rhee and others after him, South Korea is essentially a military dictatorship into the 1960s and arguably even into the 70s. And the process of democratizing South Korea and rebuilding South Korea's economy after the Korean War is one that becomes important in the Cold War. And not only Korea, but Japan, because Japan receives an economic boom during the Korean War. And eventually, of course, both Japan and South Korea will be showpieces for the capitalist world and their claim that capitalism is the proper way for developing nations to develop. Okay, so that's it for today, and tomorrow we will get more into Eisenhower and some of his policies, including his nuclear policies and massive retaliation, and how the Korean War informed some of these policies.